right. Well, first of all, welcome, Sylvia. And as I said, we're going to be talking about interviewing. And I mean, I know you've had experience with this, but what I'm going to do is try to take you to some deeper things and give you some tips on this. Because after all, interviewing is our tool. It's the thing that we do. I can tell you that many years ago, I worked with a person at the Iowa City Press Citizen who continually was asking me questions about things that I liked. And she was able to suck out of me what my favorite baseball team, what my favorite, who my favorite philosophers were, and also that I like Star Trek. So, I mean, embarrassing things that she could suck out of me. And I remember talking to some friends of mine about it, and in the newsroom, and saying, wow, that Kathy is really nice. She's so interesting and interested in people. And one of my friends said, well, don't you understand what she's doing? She's practicing interviewing. And so that's something that I always want to tell young reporters is practice interviewing. Just ask people questions, ask strangers questions, ask members of your family questions, because it first of all will build up your curiosity, and second of all, it'll give you good practice. Many years ago, I worked at a radio station. So before I worked at newspapers, I was in broadcasting. And the news director came up to me and another person in the newsroom and said, what's the first thing you do when you get to a fire? And I said, well, I'm going to say, hi, I'm Lyle Muller. I'm a reporter with KLWW Radio, and I would like to ask you a few questions. And the other person said, what happened? So he got right to the point. I think that the approach to take is sort of a combination of those things. But certainly the second reporter, my other friend in the newsroom, certainly knew what he was trying to find out, and that is what happened. That's why we're there. So let me start off this whole thing with the main point. So what I'm going to show you next is the main point of an interview, and that is that truth rules. That's what we're all about. And before I get into some of the tips and thoughts about the interviewing, I want to talk about just the ethics of interviewing. First of all, we're trying to find the truth. That's the goal. Your first clue that something should be fact-checked is that someone tells it to you. So we're trying to find out the truth. People will tell you things, and they may or may not have a full understanding of it, but we're always trying to pursue the truth. So some quick ethics about interviewing. You're responsible for accurate reporting, and that means verifying the information before releasing it. I talk with a lot of young reporters who will publish, or they'll try to publish something as fact, and their response when I ask them why they think it should be in the story is that someone said it. Our goal is not to get quotes. Our goal is to learn information. If you take that approach, you will get good quotes. So you're responsible for accurate reporting. That's our goal out there. Use original sources whenever possible. You be the reporter whose sources other people cite. That's the goal. Provide context and make sure you're trying to get that in your interviews. If someone says that they went downtown, ask them downtown where and when. Use specific terms. Don't simplify things. We want to be as specific as possible, especially with investigative reporting, but in all of our reporting. And then just gather, update, and correct information. You want to make sure you consider that the motives of the person you're interviewing, especially before promising anonymity, and IowaWatch traditionally does not give anonymity unless there's a certain reason behind that protects the person, protects the information, or gives us accurate information that we otherwise wouldn't be able to get. You want to reserve anonymity for sources who may face danger, retribution, or harm. and have information that you can't get somewhere else. And when you do report this, explain why anonymity was granted. Always have conversations with your editor about anonymity, because you want to make sure that you're not making promises that the institution can't make, especially given that once you make that promise, I believe you're ethically bound to keep the promise. So you don't want to get into difficulty with the editor. Seek sources whose voices we seldom hear. A lot of times we go to our tribe when we want to interview people. They're people with whom we're comfortable. But you want to make sure that you're getting the real voices, because you're trying to reflect what's going on in the real world. And what I mean by this is sources we often hear are officials, the director of something, the council member, the mayor. What you really want to do is find out what people are really thinking beyond what folks in officialdom think. Many years ago, I worked with a person who was covering a story about religion. And the story that the reporter initially turned in was about how successful the children's ministry was in the church. And the sources for the story were the pastor and associate pastor. And I said, well, how do you know that it's successful? And the reporter said, well, the pastors say it is. And I says, I'm going to tell you something. Pastors lie. And there was this like, oh my gosh, what have you just said? But even a pastor in a position of authority talking about a program over which the pastor is in charge is predisposed to tell you how good it is. But if you went to the voices that you seldom hear, which would be the parents, then you could find out if the program was successful. The rest of these, they're avoid stereotyping, don't distort facts, including visual information, label illustrations, reenactments, never plagiarize, always attribute. So as we're talking to people, we want to attribute what to the correct source. So that's the ethics thing that I always want to go through because I think they're important. All right, now, yeah, there's Suzanne. Are you asking a question? Class, yes.
Yes. A few slides ago, you included something about including context.
Mm-hmm.
And I find that I get to explain that a lot more than I think I had. I don't know, maybe I'm thinking incorrectly, but I'm just wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more on what you mean by context.
Yeah, I can elaborate, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit later as well.
Okay.
And
apologies for interrupting.
That's all right. And by the way, Sylvia, you can interrupt too. And so what I mean by context is a statement can mean something in one setting, but not in another. So for example, if you're interviewing a politician and a politician says, I just want what's best for the public. And you ask the follow-up question, which would be, and what is that? And the politician says, well, I want taxes to be low because that gives people more money to spend out of their pockets. And the follow-up question, because there are always follow-up questions, is, well, which taxes? Sales tax or property tax or income tax? And that's where the context comes in, because income tax is based on a certain percentage that you might pay out of your salary. A sales tax is a tax that is a proportion of your salary, but is the same amount whether you get $10,000 a year salary or $100,000 a year salary. And all of these, these taxes are all different. that you pay, and you need to understand what the tax is and in what world that gets paid and by whom. And so the context gets into the things such as sales tax is, if you pay 6% sales tax on every dollar you spend, and you make $20,000 a year, then you pay proportionally more of your salary for taxes than if it's an income tax. So that's kind of that's one example. But I'm going to get into a few other ones here in a bit. Your interview starts with the story. Know what story you're going to tell. Have a story. I'll talk with young reporters, and they'll come to me and say, I want to do a story about world hunger. Who would be good sources for that? And my response is, what story do you want to tell about world hunger? Because world hunger is a topic, it's not a story. The story might be Iowa's role in solving world hunger. Then you can start thinking about what you want to ask and to whom you want to ask. But don't start with a topic and wonder who the sources are. Once you have your story that you want to tell, I wouldn't start with the sources either. Because what I tell young reporters is that if you don't know what you want to ask that person, don't waste their time. Have a story and have questions and tell it from the audience's point of view. Those are the two things that we're trying to do when we're interviewing people. So you're interviewing someone for answers to the questions that have to be answered for the story, and you're doing it on behalf of the audience. And I really stress that you're doing it on behalf of the audience because we can get into interviews and ask questions and sources will start rambling, and then they'll say, you know, don't print that. Which, by the way, we always respond with, well, my job is to print that. So, you know, there's no other reason to interview you. Or they'll answer the question and you'll get back in their way and you'll get back to your desk and you'll go, wait a minute, they didn't answer the question the right way. Or they'll say, well, I don't think people need to know that. Or why are you asking me such a mean question or a difficult question? The answer always is because the audience is going to ask me to answer that question in my story. So those are the two things that you need. You have to have a story to tell, and you have to tell it from the audience's point of view. That frames how we go about interviewing people. A good interview will yield a good story. Have you had the opportunity yet where you've done an interview and it went so well that you were writing the story in your head faster than you were writing it on the paper? That's happened to me, happens to all of us. It's a good interview. We've gotten some information. So it all starts with that story. Here are some things you need to do to really have a successful interview. Prep work, research ahead of time, know your topic. You don't want to start an interview with saying, what do you do? And you really want to understand the topic a little bit. What you want to understand you want to understand it is to the point where you can be curious and ask questions. When I was a reporter, I covered health science and higher education. I wasn't particularly knowledgeable about any of that stuff, but I was really curious. And so I would go into University of Iowa physicists who were discovering things in the solar system, not knowing or understanding the mathematical problems that they solved to make their discoveries, but curious about how they use that mathematics. So I would know ahead of time enough about what they were doing so that I at least knew the topic. If you don't know the topic, an interviewee will sniff that out in an instant, and you'll lose all credibility. Know what you want to ask. Again, this gets back to reporters with whom I speak who are trying to figure out what sources they need for a story. Pardon me, I'll get rid of that. They'll want to know what sources they need for a story, and I'll say, well, what do you want to ask them? And they don't know. Don't waste your time. The progression that I see in young reporters is they come up with a story idea, they try to figure out which sources to interview, and then they start figuring out what questions they want to ask a few interviews in. That's backwards. Know what story you want, know what questions you want to ask, then find the sources who can answer the questions. Because again, a lot of young reporters are trying to make quotes, and ooh, I'm much more interested in information than quotes. You should make notes about specific things you want to learn in an interview, but I would suggest refraining from scripting every question. Many years ago, I was able to interview Jay Leno, who was in Iowa City for a comedy show. I scripted out about 15, 16 questions, and I zipped through them in about 15, 16 minutes. And then I got to the end, and it was like, I'm done. Thanks for your time. And then he says, you know, hey, I want to talk to you, you know, with his Jay Leno voice. And he starts asking me about popular places in Iowa City. And then he, you know, what was weird about Iowa City, what was fun about Iowa City. And then he tried to joke on me about, you know, toy rabbits that have real rabbit fur. Why would you want a toy rabbit with real rabbit fur when you can get a real rabbit with real rabbit fur? And all this kind of goofy stuff. And I got done, and my interview was horrible. My story was horrible. But I realized at that moment that what I had done was scripted an interview instead of having a conversation. And the reason I understood that was because Jay Leno had a conversation with me and then did jokes that night about spaces in Iowa City and all of the fun kinds of things that you could do in Iowa City. So, you know, you want to just be careful about scripting questions. I talked about interviewing the right people, and those are the ones who can answer the questions you have. Ask the right questions. Again, you want to learn stuff and then get your answer. And this is a tough one for folks. This will happen to every reporter. They will ask a question and the person doesn't give the answer, even though they're talking. Instead, they'll give some sort of superfluous response or something without detail. Sometimes they misunderstand the question and give a wrong, you know, an answer to something else. Politicians, whom we interview a lot, will give their canned answer. What you want to do is get your answer. And if people veer away from that, steer that conversation back to the question. Follow up. Ways to do that are say, I understand that, but that didn't quite answer my question. What I really need to know is, or, okay, I understand that, but readers are going to ask me specifically for the answer to this question. And what do you want to tell them when they ask you that question? That's a way to try to deal with trying to get this back, because people will ramble and get off track, or they'll try to hide the answer. Sometimes they'll say no comment, and it doesn't really mean no comment. If someone says no comment, say, are you sure? Because readers are going to ask what you say about this. And so whenever someone tells me no comment, I never let that one go. Sometimes they don't comment, but When they don't, I'll ask them why. Why don't you want to comment? Because I'm going to put in the story the reason you didn't comment, because readers are going to want that comment. And at least you get a reason, and if they say, I just don't want to tell you, I say, all right, well, that's what I'll put in the story. And they'll say, go ahead. But a lot of times they'll tell you, I don't want to comment because I just don't know the full story. Or I don't want to comment because she's a friend of mine and I don't want to say anything derogatory to her. Or I don't want to comment because it's under investigation. And then you answer the reader's questions, because in your interviews, you're trying to answer readers' questions. A reader will look at no comment and go, what the hell is that all about? And then they won't read the rest of the story or think about the rest of the story because they're hung up on the no comment. But if you tell them why, then they get their answer and you can move on. And then politicians' answers often are designed to be just rhetoric. I mean, every time they're talking to you, they're just trying to convince people. Some years ago, I was interviewing Dave Loebsack when he was in Congress about how Iowans should remember veterans. And he goes, how Iowans should remember veterans? And I interrupted him. I said, you know what? I really want the real answer. I don't want the political answer that you're going to give me. And he stopped a second. He says, all right, the real answer, not the political answer. And he thought about it. And then he launched into a really nice answer about don't just give veterans lip service, thank them and let them know that you're honoring them in certain ways. It was a rarity. I've rarely had a politician when I do that to them veer off their talking points. I know I had asked the governor the same question for that story, and she gave me, she just still went ahead with the rhetorical thing. When you're in the interview, be in the moment. I mentioned having a conversation. That's really a good, comfortable way. First of all, it loosens people up. And it gives you the opportunity to listen. So that conversation the interview that I did that was scripted with Jay Leno yielded a pretty poor story. But the conversation Jay Leno had with me yielded him a comedy routine that he could tailor to Iowa City that night, because he was learning stuff and he was listening. Listen to folks, let them go. If they stop or pause in the interview, don't say anything. Let them keep going. Whenever there's an awkward pause in a conversation between two people, someone always feels a need to fill that awkward pause. If you don't do it, the interviewee will. And that's when he or she will start telling you the stuff that they forgot or didn't want to tell you, or that context that we were talking about before. That's when you find out, that all of these things from their past or their experiences. So when they stop talking and they pause, let it go for a little bit and see if they talk more. I always suggest that you're able to read back quotes and themes from the interview. We don't tell people what we're writing and we don't show them our notebooks. But when someone asks me, what do you have me saying in your notes? I don't mind that because it shows them that I've been listening. And sources will ask you to see the quotes. They'll want you to write them and see it, and then they'll look at them and they'll try to change the syntax or try to change what they said. I'm not a fan of that. But instead I'll read back. And then if you're having a conversation, you'll actually learn if you misquoted them, first of all. Second of all, they might hear that quote and go, yeah, that's not quite what I meant. And then you learn what they meant. But that third byproduct is they trust you. And you're able to demonstrate that you're listening to them authentically, which then loosens them up to tell you more stuff. Don't be afraid to ask personal questions. How old are you? What's your birth date? They seem personal, you know. I mean, you know, but go ahead. I mean, we do stories where we ask college students how much debt they have. We ask people how much they earn. All of these types of things that are intrusive. And as nice Iowans who are taught not to be intrusive, this seems a little counterintuitive, but this is what we do. And those small details actually give a lot of breadth to your story. They give us the currency that we need, that information that's really important. It's okay to convey deadline issues and an importance of knowing answers right now. And sound firm and reasonable, but don't be a jerk. And what I mean by this is, as you're asking questions, don't be apologetic for asking them. Really have that authority as a reporter who's going to do things right. And as a student and an intern, you know, we're at the beginning of our career. So you kind of want to pull back, but go ahead and be firm. At IowaWatch a few years ago, we were talking about interviewing, and there was one person who was just scared to call people and do interviews, and he wouldn't get calls back. And another person on the IowaWatch staff, a student at the University of Iowa, said, well, I never have problems getting interviews. And they said, well, why not? And she says, well, I just call them up and tell them what I want to know and start asking questions. Well, that's the authority, right? And when you're calling people, tell them you're a reporter. Don't tell them you don't need to necessarily tell them you're a student. Be authentic. This is the truth part. When people are talking to you, be authentic. Use actual quotes. I'm not a big fan of parentheticals. I don't know what you feel about those, Suzanne, but I'm not a big fan of parentheticals in quotes because they're not quotes. They're you turning the quote into something. And it's not authentic.
I also think that parenthetical citations or the use of them in quotes can also cause somebody to distrust the quote. You know, if I'm a reader and I see that, I'm wondering, well, I also feel this way about ellipses in quotes as well. You know, use them sparingly, both of them, because I feel like you're giving a signal to the reader that you chose to remove something, and then they wonder what that is, and then they start, well, what else are they missing in this? So it's amazing what the power of punctuation can convey. And I don't know that a reader would articulate it that way, but that's been my experience when I've had people ask about that.
Yep, I totally agree. Just paraphrase it. You know, don't interject yourself into the quote. Don't surmise that what an interview subject tells you without knowing or double checking that you're correct. In other words, if they tell you something, they may mean one thing and you may interpret it differently. So just ask them to clarify. Say, yeah, I want to make sure I understand correctly. I mean, a third of my interviews are, I just want to make sure I understand that. Or I'm gonna paraphrase what I think you said. And I want to make sure that that's correct. Number one, you're having a conversation. Number two, you're accurate, which is great. Number three, it builds trust. And then they start telling you more. And then fact check. So Iowa had a governor, Terry Branstad, who would say stuff off the top of his head, and they were fractured quotes, but he also would misremember. He wasn't doing anything heinous. It wasn't like he was trying to mislead people. He just would forget facts, but he'd still say them. And so we always had to fact check him. And we had an IowaWatch intern one year who interviewed the governor. on a Tuesday and didn't get to publish the story until Friday because he spent 3 days fact checking. And the governor had just not remembered correctly. So we finally found the accurate information, called back to the governor's office, and the press secretary said, yeah, he was just trying to remember. So yeah, go with what you got. So always fact check. Pretty cool, huh? Don't be charmed. All right. So, all right, enough of that guy. That was me on the mountain too, by the way. Don't be charmed. My lookalike, Bernie, what happens is we'll see these famous people or these amazing things, and we're in awe. And you're sitting there thinking, I'm interviewing Bernie Sanders. And then you get back and you look at your notes and you don't have anything because Bernie Sanders didn't tell you anything. You may have thought he was at the time, but the reason you thought he was telling you something is because you're talking to Bernie Sanders. And he didn't tell you anything. And I would run into this. I told you I covered health and science, and I mentioned the physics professors at the University of Iowa. They included James Van Allen, the founder of the Van Allen radiation belts. And I would go up to his office at 701 Van Allen and ask him, hey, what are you working on? And I remember one time, and this is me as a seasoned reporter, he said, well, I just got some new data from from Neptune, and I've made this amazing discovery, and I'm getting ready to write a paper on it. Here, let me show it to you. And he starts showing me his math of this thing he discovered. And I'm thinking to myself, holy crap, James Van Allen is telling me stuff before telling everybody else. And pretty soon I had to grab myself mentally and say, all right, you better start asking him what this means, because you're just going gaga. And I had known him for years and had interviewed him for several stories, but even as a seasoned journalist, it was pretty amazing. So don't be charmed. Bernie Sanders put his pants on one leg at a time this morning. He had to go to the bathroom. He had to wash his face and brush his teeth, just like the rest of us. But that guy, nah. All right, I've talked about what you do in the interview. Now we're going to talk about getting the interview, because that's a big hurdle for people. And I think it's more difficult in some ways now than it was when I was a young reporter, because we didn't have the internet, and you were used to calling people up and getting calls and cold calls, right? Out of the 3 in the afternoon, a phone call, and it'd be someone saying, yeah, I'm so-and-so, I want to talk to you about something. And you go, okay. We're not quite wired that way now, it seems, because we always want an email first or a text instead of just calling somebody up. Here are some tips on getting an interview. When you're calling somebody, assert your authority. Carry that attitude that you're doing a job. Don't be apologetic about it. Carry authority with it. I'm a reporter with IowaWatch, a nonprofit news organization, and I'm writing a story about remember, you're doing this for the public, not for you, because then that gives you confidence too. So sometimes we think, all right, I have to call, all right, this banker's just been accused of embezzling, and now I have to call him. That kind of scares the bejeebers out of me. I don't know if I can make that call. That's pretty hard. Well, yeah, it's pretty hard for you to do it for you on your behalf of yourself. But what if you're making that call on behalf of the public that wants to know? All of a sudden, to me, it becomes an easier phone call, because I know why I'm making the call. I'm not calling because I'm a prying, nosy neighbor. I'm prying because the public wants to know, and they're counting on me to find out. So if you take that attitude into calling for the interview, that can help. And let them know that you're a professional doing a necessary job just as others involved are. Many years ago, I went to a fire in it was about 15 below zero. And the cops made reporters park 3/4 of a mile away. And so we did, and we went trucks and across over to the fire. And when we got there, I saw the utility companies, I saw insurance adjusters. And so after it was over, I talked to the sheriff and I said, what was the deal there? And he said, well, they had a job to do. And I said, well, so did we. We had a job to do. It was a necessary job. But you parked us 3/4 of a mile away and put our lives at risk in 15 below. Let's change that. And we did. We did all this type of stuff. The idea is, again, if you're calling and it feels scary to make that call, if you're doing it for the public, which is the profession that you're doing, it's a professional doing a necessary job, just like everybody else calling, say, that bank examiner are, like the board of directors, investigators, his wife. I mentioned conversation. It loosens up the interview subjects. It's also more relaxed. They'll talk more. And then listening helps you to respond in the conversation. And by the way, also ask follow-up questions, right? Learn things you didn't expect. A lot of times, I would learn additional stories in these conversations, or I'd learn a lead that I didn't know would exist. Establish that you're writing, and this, for us, you're writing a story for IowaWatch, which distributes stories to other media. But as you get into other jobs, if you're at a newspaper or TV or radio station, when you're trying to get an interview with someone, tell them that you're writing the story that'll be in the newspaper and online, of course. And the reason you do this is because we all are used to seeing or hearing news in a newspaper, TV, radio, or online. And we never question how that information that we are relying on came about. Well, it came about by a reporter somewhere else calling up and trying to do the interview. If you establish that you're writing the story that will be published, you've, number one, told that source right off the bat, the story is going to be published with or without their comment, just like every other story, and that it just happens to be their turn at this time. And you're also going to establish in their minds that those stories have quotes from the people involved. It's a weird psychology that happens, because if you were to call them up and say, hey, I'd like to do a story, then they can say, no, I'm not going to help you, and therefore you can't do a story. Because I'd like to do a story is not an incentive for a source to talk to you. But if you are telling them you're writing the story that will be published, then you've established that it's going to happen. And they actually need to be there. And by the way, here's your reason that you want to tell them, because the story is going to be published with or without them, but you want to make sure you get the story right. And the person who can get the story right is the person you're trying to interview. Bonus tip, don't ask for an interview. Ask sources if they'll answer questions for you for a story you're writing. If you ask for an interview and the person says no, they've answered your question. But that's not the question you want to ask. The question you want to ask is going to give you pertinent information for your story. So instead of asking for an interview, which they could say no, ask the sources, do you have time? Because I'm writing a story about the forfeiture rate in Waterloo, Iowa, and I need information from you. It changes the whole landscape on which people are standing. So I'm Sylvia Oakland, the person writing a story about this for IowaWatch, a nonprofit news organization. What happened? Right? Let them know. So you tell them who you are so that we're open, and then ask them what happened. The combination of the two answers that I started with in the presentation. I've saved time, a lot of time, to talk about emails because we're in the email era in which people email back and forth. We rely on them. They help us get things done faster. And they also take care of things like I'm afraid to talk to people. Can't be afraid to talk to people. I love talking to people. Emails are exchanges of information. They're not conversations. Since they're not conversations, they're not really interviews. They're not valuable for interviews. They are, they can be, excuse me, they can be valuable when you need information. I'm going to clear my cough. Right? You need something. Yeah, I'm writing my story. What's your population? I forgot to ask. That's okay. But a whole interview, it's just not going to be worthwhile in an email. This is an email by a former IowaWatch intern, Emily Hynum, when she was at the University of Dubuque. And she needed some information about a silica sand mine in Northeast Iowa. She got some records and she saw that what she got wasn't aligning with records that she had gotten somewhere else. So if you can imagine the milligrams per meter or whatever sign doesn't translate in a conversation. So she gave them a specific statement about what she wanted to find out, and that she wanted to do it in a phone interview on the record. Good use of email. Laid out the specifics, and then she got her interview. I want to show you another example from a former IowaWatch intern, Rana Mustafa, who was doing a story about depression. And on February 7th of 2014 at 8:19 in the morning, she sent a note to Kathleen Staley at the University of Iowa, telling her who she was, what she was doing, why she was reaching out to her, dropped a name, and had some questions for her. This was the, I just want to point out, by the way, February 7th, 8:19. That afternoon, she got a response. Thank you for the note. Yeah, our staff is happy to provide an outreach program for faculty. We do this on a request basis. Please let me know if this request is being made. Not responsive, right? Like, yeah, we'd come out and do that. She totally misunderstood the question. So Rana talked with me about it, and then on February 12th, said, I'd like to discuss this further. I told Rana that you needed to talk to her. Can I give you a call tomorrow? I also told her, by the way, and this is an important tip, when you're trying to set up an interview, give them a time frame. And that's exactly what Rana did here. Can I give you a call tomorrow? I'm available from 12:30 to 2 p.m. You know, she didn't say, hey, I want to discuss with you further what time works for you. She picked the time because it was deadline driven. So she said, I'm available 12:30 to 2 p.m. What time works best for you? It'd be about a 10-minute conversation. And here are some things I want to know. Again, I'll be using this information for a journalistic story I'm working on for IowaWatch. Thanks for your time. Very friendly. Sorry, didn't have time today. I do have time. Talk tomorrow at 4. It works for you. Thank you, Kathy Staley. Everything's friendly. But if you notice, it's the day after Rana, and it's at 5. It's the end of the day. And now it's Monday, February 17th. Remember, this started February 7th. Tried getting a hold of you. The secretary said you were out. My story's due tomorrow. I'm under a time crunch. Conveyed deadline. Rana's doing everything the right way. So I'll call you back tomorrow or later this afternoon. February 18th. Sorry, I was out with, she was sick, so I took that out of the email. Left you a voice message, information about the training. Now, if this seems tedious to you that I'm going through these emails, that's the intended effect, because this is annoying. Miss Staley, by the way, you know, thanks for the note. Do you have contact information? Do you have, so you've not done training this year, right? And the thing was faculty said that they did, or her office said they did training, but we're finding out that actually she didn't do any training. Not aware of training for faculty on depression, but can check further with our staff when they return from a conference next week. We did do 3 talks on issues of depression for students group, Kathy Staley. My story is actually getting published next week. It's due tonight. I was informed you are the assistant outreach director. You handle these things. I am outreach coordinator and have statistics that we did 3 outreach programs on depression for students. Remember Kathy Staley? She's now become Kathleen H. Staley, PhD. This is deteriorating. So you said you've not done training, and you see what's going on back and forth, when a phone conversation could have handled this. Now, in Rana's defense, she was trying to do that. And Kathy, later, Dr. Staley, was just putting her off. Do it, and here Dr. Staley again, you know, with more responses. And here's a note to me. Rana just gave up. I don't know what to do about this. It's kind of disorganized, not straightforward. Absolutely right. And 11 days after the initial email. So if going through all of those emails was annoying for you, imagine how annoying it was for Rana and Kathy Staley, the source. And she couldn't get her information. She eventually did get information from other sources. So some wrap-up stuff here. Know what your story is. You need to know what that story is. Don't waste any time until you figure out what your story is. And what I mean by that is, you know the question you want answered. You may not, you know, you're not going to know the answer. We're not prescribing stories, but know what you want to know. Be confident and direct when seeking an interview. It's okay that you're doing this. I don't know if you've ever dealt with a waiter, waitress, insurance agent, shop clerk, anything like that, but they're confident, right? You know, where can I find the aspirin? It's right over there. Well, they're confident with their work. We're confident with our work. It builds confidence with those folks and also helps you as a writer, and it actually helps you get a better interview because you're not afraid to have a conversation. Related to having a conversation is sometimes, I don't know if you use a recorder. I do too. or a notebook or both. We have this point in time where we take our notebook and we say, all right, that wraps that up. Thank you. Close our notebook, take our phone or whatever we're recording with and turn it off. And then we say something like, yeah, the story's going to be published such and such. I'm still interviewing some people. Think of something that they said that you thought was really important for your story and say, I was really interested. It was really helpful, but what really interests me is when you talked about the budget, whatever. They'll start talking again. In many cases, not always. And when they start talking, because they think the interview's done, right? Now they start having a conversation because the interview's done, but they're talking about more information. And now comes those neat quotes. So here's what you do with your notebook that you closed. You open it back up again, and in front of them, write notes. Say, yeah, I'm going to use that in my story. Turn the recorder back on. I've got interviews I did an interview last week with a guy. I turned the recorder off and was taking his picture. He started talking again, and I just turned it right back on and kept the notes going. So, right, your goal is not to do an interview. Your goal is to get information. And so as long as they're getting information, it's on the record, as long as you say. Be a good listener. If they say something that you don't understand, ask for clarification. If they say something that surprises you, that could be your story. If they say something you weren't prepared to learn about and it gets in the way of the story you were there to do, but it also is interesting, interview them for both stories. Be a good listener. Get the answers you need, not what the source wants to spin. And, you know, this is real important because, again, we'll interview people, we hear what we think is the answer, we'll get back and we'll look at our notes and we realize that they didn't answer it at all. So get the answers you need, not the answers you want, the answers you need. And keep at them until they give it to you. And if it's you're just not going to bleed it out of them, then that's the way it is. But answer for the readers why you couldn't get the answer. Asked several times, he said he declined comment. Eventually, he said he wasn't going to comment because. And emails are exchanges of information, not interviews. I can't stress that enough. You're just not going to have that nuance back and forth. It's just going to be short and canned. All right. Any questions, comments, feedback, pushback?
I do have a question. So I'm working on a story about the lack of diversity in higher education. And I've reached out to all three of the secretaries at the big three universities here in Iowa, and trying to get in contact also with the previous presidents. And their marketing team basically told me that they would pass along the information and get back to me, because I didn't at the time know the contact information for those previous presidents. So I was wondering how to kind of get around that, because they were both female presidents for the university, which I thought was really an important thing to consider when the rest of them had been male.
Okay, so you're trying to get a hold of the previous presidents to talk about diversity, or what?
Yeah, because they, looking at the data and looking at the timeline, most of the presidents have been white and male.
Yeah.
And so in the past, I think it was 2 or 3 decades, they had started to at least become white and female rather than just white and male. And the newest presidents for the University of Iowa and Iowa State University are both women presidents.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was trying to get in contact with the two previous
Previous
presidents
yeah.
to understand like their kind of the reason why they, they applied for the position and what that process was like for them.
Yeah, that's going to be a tough one to get a hold of them, but, unless their number. I'm trying to think. Leith, the guy at Iowa State, is it Texas? I think Stephen Leith, and I'm not sure where. Texas A&M. I can't remember where, but you call their office and you keep hounding them about it. Leith left Iowa under a dark cloud, so he might be suspicious of calls like that. As far as Bruce Harold, I'm not sure how to get a hold of him because he's retired, and so he's kind of like gone home wherever that is, or wherever places those are. That could be pretty tough. Have you talked to Janine Beck at the University of Iowa?
I'm not sure. I can see who I've been emailing back and forth with really quick. So at University of Iowa, I've been emailing with Ann Bassett. I think it was because they were a part of the media.
I don't know her. Well, try someone called Janine Beck. She's the head of their communications office. Call her.
Okay.